Hello, and welcome to this APUSH review for the AP US History test. We are going to start right off with Unit 1, and if you want to follow along with these notes, you just have to go to zerolimitproductions.com/APUSH. These are 43 pages of notes, all handwritten by me, and let's get right into it. So in Unit 1 goes from 1491 to 1607. Basically, it is everything that happened before the Americas were settled on by the U.S., or what would become the U.S. Basically, started off with saying how natives of American society were diverse. That is the whole focus of Unit 1. There were a bunch of different native societies that were on the Native American continent, like the Pueblo, who were planters and farmers, and they built small urban centers and cliff dwellings. And the Utes that were hunter-gatherers and nomadic instead of harvesters. The Chumash that had fisher villages, so they were kind of like the planters and farmers, how they didn't move, but they were hunters, but for fish. The Chinook built huge houses that housed multiple families, so they stayed in one place. The Iroquois planted corn and farmed, just like the Pueblo, and they built longhouses made of wood. That was a major identifying factor of the Iroquois. The Cahokia were farmers, and they had a centralized government, just like the Americas would have. The natives of America were influenced by environments and advanced from that. Basically, they became the type of societies they were because of their environment. Like, the Pueblo were planters and farmers along with the Iroquois because they were on fertile land. Now in 1492, Christopher Columbus lands North America. You might know the rhyme, he sailed the ocean blue in 1492 or something like that. The Columbian Exchange came from Christopher Columbus landing and finding this. The Columbian Exchange is the transfer of foods and diseases and ideas between continents, from the European continents to the Americas. Now, the encomienda system enslaved natives to mine and farm for the Spanish. So the Spanish enslaved the natives. So basically, Christopher Columbus came to this continent, then enslaved the natives to mine and farm for them. The caste system classified people by race for Europeans. That's basically how the hierarchy was all by race. Now that is Unit 1, quick and easy, right? That won't be the same for some future ones. I don't know why I put that down there. There's still Unit 2 on this page. Unit 2. Unit 2 is 1607 to 1754. Big focus of this was it compared different motives and methods Europeans used to colonize the Americas. Now, Britain was struggling from the Columbian Exchange. They had the enclosure movement going on, and they were sailing across the sea to find new economic endeavors. That's why they went to the Americas, to find more chance to make money, basically. They founded Jamestown, which was purely for money seeking. Like, they were just looking for gold, looking for things to make money from. Which means by 1610, 7 out of 8 of the settlers were dead. And basically, John Rolfe had to come in 1612. He discovered tobacco there and how to farm it, and revived the economy and revived everything in Jamestown. They had indentured servants working on farms. Indentured servitude is basically you have a contract to work for 7 or so years and then you're set free, and that's for like passage over the ocean to get to America. Tension increased between natives and Britain because Britain kept getting closer and closer and further into the natives' land, because the natives have been there forever, basically. And Britain just kept creeping closer to them, getting on their nerves. And the tensions kept rising and rising, and this resulted in Bacon's Rebellion. Basically, the Native Americans were raiding Jamestown's farms, and the government of Jamestown wasn't helping protect farmers. Like, they wouldn't come help with their armies to protect it from the Native Americans raiding them. So Nathaniel Bacon, a farmer, led other farmers to attack Indians, and then eventually the government, and burned a heck of a lot of crap for them. Unfortunately, Bacon's rebellion was squashed, and Bacon died. So, moving on to the next page, page 3. New England was founded, and it was not as money focused, it was more focused on actually being a society and a community. Unfortunately, Diseases killed 50% of the original settlers there, and that's New England. In the West Indies, like Barbados was growing tobacco, but tobacco's price fell and wasn't as profitable anymore. So they started to grow sugarcane. They discovered sugarcane, and it requires a lot of work to grow that sugarcane. So the demand for enslaved people went up. So they wanted more enslaved people to come over to the West Indies. In the middle colonies, they had a success on export economy, which export economy just means you need to be exporting more than you're importing. So basically you have a profit. I mean, that's pretty obvious. In the middle colonies, there was a very clear separation between the working class, slaves, and wealthy people. This established the hierarchy of, life. In Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker, and basically they loved everyone. It became a safe haven for anyone who was being discriminated against. And instead of taking the land from the natives, they actually received the land from the natives because of negotiations. Governments became increasingly elite throughout the colonies. They had each of their own governments, but it was almost always dominated by wealthy white males. Now, the triangular trade helped West Indies get the slaves that they needed. Basically, New England sent their rum to Africa, Africa sent their slaves to the West Indies, and West Indies sent sugarcane to New England. That is the triangular trade. Mercantilism basically believes that there's a fixed amount of wealth in this world, and just like the export economy, you must have more exports than imports. The Navigation Acts basically made it so anything exporting or importing needed to pass through a British port, and everything must be taxed. Now, there was a lot of slave resistances throughout these colonies. Some were overt and some were covert. Those were the two types of slave resistances. Overt meant just destroy everything, go rampant, resist any way you can. Covert is basically like secretly keeping traditions and cultures alive from Africa and just from your family, and that would go against the assimilation that all of the white people wanted. Now, Metacom's War, or King Philip's War, which the British called it, Metacom hated the British, so he was like, the British must be forced out. But they had a war, and things didn't really go well for the Indians, so Metacom ended up dying, which just killed the whole thought of having a war. And it signified that all was not well between colonists and Indians. Now, the Enlightenment is coming up with, basically, the Enlightenment was the start of having an emphasis on feelings over intellect / using our brains, basically using our hearts more than our brains. And that's when the idea of natural rights was introduced, and the idea of checks and balances was introduced. This was also when the three sectors of government was introduced: executive, judicial, and legislative. That's when these ideas first sprouted. The New Light clergy started the Great Awakening. It was preaching against government and more towards independent thought. They had intense Christian enthusiasm. That's what the Great Awakening was. It woke up everyone's Christian love. Now, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were big parts of the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was the idealist, and George Whitefield was a fire preacher. What was, I don't know. I can't remember. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. They were both trying to figure out the true American identity, and we're thinking maybe it's time to reject the British and become independent. That's where that idea first started, with Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Now, colonial impressment was the seizing of colonial men and forcing them to be a part of Britain's navy, basically conquering their ships and forcing them to be a part of their crew now. The colonies became increasingly aware of their natural rights and that they have the right to not be conquered like that, Now that is Unit 2. Moving on to Unit 3. Unit 3 goes from 1754 to 1800. This was basically focused on how America went from a bunch of British colonies to its own distinct nation. The French and Indian War, basically the French was getting too close to the British, and the British was getting too close to the French. They were encroaching on each other's property, and that was how it started. Throughout this, Benjamin Franklin had the idea for the Albany Plan of Union, which called for a more united central government. It called for being more coordinated in war and defense, and it laid the mold for the American Revolution. The consequences of the French and Indian War were that colonists got to expand westward. Conflicts with Indians always occur when they're expanding, so lots of fighting was happening as they were westward expanding. And the French and Indian War was very expensive. British debts had doubled through this war, and to pay for war, this is when the taxes start. British control. So the British controlled the colonists. They used to just have salutary neglect, which just meant the colonists got to manage themselves. The Quartering Act of 1765 kept British troops in Americas after the French and Indian War ended. And this is actually when the Sugar Act started, which taxed sugar. And the Stamp Act taxed paper goods. So both those were put into effect. Now this is a term you might need to know is virtual representation, which basically means Parliament represented all classes of citizens, but not all localities. Basically, Parliament kind of represented the colonists, but they really didn't. They represented the middle class and the low class and the high class, but not with how the colonists wanted it. The Sons of Liberty, in response to those taxes, the Stamp Act, Congress asked Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and taxes were repealed because of protests and damages colonists did. So they did a bunch of damage and were threatening these tax collectors, and so those taxes, like the Stamp Act, were repealed. The Declaratory Act basically gave Britain the right to pass any law or act in the colonies. It was Britain saying, hey, you may have gotten that tax removed, but we still control you and we still have any right to do anything. Which they then passed the Townshend Acts, which resulted in highly organized protests once again. They boycotted British goods, and the 1770 Boston Massacre occurred because of the Townshend Act. The Boston Tea Party was a response to the Tea Act of 1773, where the Sons of Liberty dumped tea into harbor, and this caused Britain to pass the Coercive Acts. The Sons of Liberty were basically colonists dressed up in Native American gear, and they went in the middle of the night and dumped tea from a shipment back into the harbor to show their protest. So the Coercive Acts were also called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, and it showed that the colonies needed to resist Britain. So Congress, there was a meeting called, and the meetings decided independence was the only thing that could save the colonists. Not everyone agreed with this, so everyone was like, which side do I be on? But Thomas Paine, you might have heard of this, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, bestseller. Everyone in the colonies read it, and it basically convinced everyone that independence was the right way to go. Moving on to page 7, I need to take a drink. Alright, now this is when the Declaration was really focused on. The Declaration was very influenced by Enlightenment thought, like we had talked about, how the 3 sectors of government and natural rights and stuff like that. Loyalists, there were some colonists still holding back, so the Loyalists didn't want to separate from Britain, so that was kind of annoying. The American Revolution started, and George Washington was elected as the commander and general. And a little bit through the battles and stuff, the Battle of Saratoga was a huge turning point. Basically, the Battle of Saratoga convinced the French that they need to ally with America instead of Britain, and we then got the French backing us up. The British were defeated at the Battle of Yorktown, and that really gave us all the power. We were finally independent from Britain. The Articles of Confederation were then created. It was basically an early constitution. In 1781, it was ratified as the new constitution. All laws would be made by legislative, and basically there weren't any balance of powers, no checks and balances. It gave the government very limited powers to tax, like we could not tax the people, which would become an issue. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was the plan for how territories would apply for statehood under the United States of America. Shays' Rebellion was something that showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Farmers that needed money from the government asked the government for money, but they didn't get it, and so they rebelled. It showed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, so then a constitutional convention was scheduled. The two sides of the Constitutional Convention were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted the strong central government. And the Anti-Federalists, if you can guess, did not want a strong central government. They wanted strong state governments. Another topic that was introduced at the Constitutional Convention was the Virginia and New Jersey plan. Virginia, really, they wanted the representation to be based on, they wanted the representation to all be equal for every state, and the other side wanted representation to be based on population instead. And this led to the Great Compromise that created the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, the 3/5 compromise was also discussed at the Constitutional Convention, where the southern states who had slaves wanted to be able to count slaves as part of their population to have more representatives in the House of Representatives. But the North didn't want that because they didn't have slaves, so they didn't have as many people, so shouldn't really be counted. And so enslaved blacks were then counted as 3/5 of a person instead of one whole person and instead of no one, which everyone was happy with. Everyone. The Federalist Papers, you might need some context. The Constitution was not getting a lot of power behind it because it was advocating for a strong central government, which was what the Federalists wanted. So, the Federalist Papers were written to help convince U.S. society to accept the Constitution and ratify it. Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison all wrote these essays. It was a collection of a ton of essays, like 80-something, and it promoted the Constitution. And people weren't really, behind this Constitution very much because it didn't have a Bill of Rights added to it, which would not ensure natural rights or any rules really. But the Federalist Papers promised that they would have a Bill of Rights with this new Constitution. Hamilton, you might have also heard, wrote the most, 51 essays. And John Jay and James Madison also wrote not as many. Now, Republican motherhood is the idea that mothers back then, instead of voting, they would raise their sons who could vote right. Basically raising educated sons, raising your sons well, so that they can become successful in the world and vote for Republican. Washington called up Hamilton and was like, hey, I need you to be my right-hand man, basically. So Hamilton thought of all of these different policies, like the National Bank, and since there was no rule about making a national bank, it invoked the elastic clause of the Constitution. And it was... Hamilton was employed by Washington, which I just said. Hamilton was a huge Federalist, and to get money back from the American Revolution, because the American Revolution cost a lot for the United States, Hamilton introduced this tax on whiskey, which was the first tax since Britain was taxing the colonists, and it led to the Whiskey Rebellion. And basically, basically, military crushed the rebellion, unlike how Shays' Rebellion rampaged everywhere. The military crushed the Whiskey Rebellion before it could even take off. They sent 10,000 troops down, and it showed the strength of the Constitution because we had the right to be able to squash these rebellions. And basically it showed the differences between the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution and how much more effective the Constitution was. Now eventually Washington did have to leave office, and so he gave his farewell address where basically he said no political parties. It would only divide the US, and also no foreign involvement, which both of these we just went and just did them both anyways. So then the John Adams presidency started. Britain and French went to war as soon as the John Adams presidency started, and the French kept stealing American ships. We were trying to stay out of the Britain and French, their war, but we had to eventually join it because we went to negotiate with the French so they would stop stealing our ships. But as soon as we got there, we were met by 3 Frenchmen who said, hey, first, before we negotiate with you, you have to pay us. You have to pay us a bribe. And that is called the XYZ affair. Moving on to page 9. Alright, the Alien and Sedition Acts made it easy to deport immigrants. The Alien Act made it easy to deport immigrants, and the Sedition Act said you could not speak poorly about the government during this. And that showed the government overreach, and it resulted in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which was the nullification crisis, in which states could basically ignore unconstitutional laws, and they could deem anything unconstitutional. So they could nullify any federal laws, and the federal government did not like that. At the end of this time period, the relationships were between the British, Spanish, and Indians, and we kept expanding westward, and that increased tensions. And the Pinckney Treaty was the thing that decided the border between Spain and America. That was a long unit. Moving on to Unit 4, which was 1800 to 1848. This unit emphasizes the expanding role of the U.S. in world affairs, the transformation of society in early years, and how Americans are using their democratic urges. Before we get into this, more water. Alright, the foreign powers. The Barbary pirates basically were paying pirates, we were paying them to trade with them, or else our ships would be taken over. Jefferson canceled this payment because he didn't like the idea of negotiating with what were basically terrorists. And they were like, okay, we don't like that you're not paying anymore, so we're going to attack your ships again. So the Barbary pirates basically won, but Jefferson got to negotiate a reduced pay after the attacks began again. Now, Jefferson was very constructionist. A constructionist focuses on exactly what is in the Constitution. A loose constructionist, the Constitution doesn't say we can't do this, so let's do it, Just like the National Bank. Louisiana is a territory that we received during this time period, and Napoleon sold it to the U.S. for $15 million, which was really cheap for how big of a territory Louisiana was. We already bought it. Someone got the offer, someone bought it for the government, and Jefferson was told this and was like, oh no. That's not in the Constitution, buying territory. What do we do? But he let it pass, because we already bought it. And he sent Lewis and Clark to go and explore the Louisiana Purchase. It expanded our diplomatic relations between Indians and Native Americans because Lewis and Clark explored and became friends with them, basically. One of the first Supreme Court cases that you need to know is Marbury v. Madison. It established judiciary review. And that basically just means that the Supreme Court is the final say on the Constitution. McCulloch v. Maryland. Oh my gosh, I can't talk. McCulloch v. Maryland. There we go. Basically just established that federal law trumps state law. Federal law is the law of the land. The War of 1812 then started, and France and Britain were fighting once again. Who knew? Impressment started again. The Democratic Republicans was a party, and they won this war. They wanted to join the War of 1812, and the Federalists were against this war. The victory created nationalism. Basically was like, yeah, we won. We're the best. Yeah. But the victory also killed the Federalist Party because they were against the war, and so people didn't really trust anyone on the Federalists. And that was when the era of good feeling started, because everyone at this point was Democratic or Republican because there wasn't a second party anymore. Basically, everyone felt very united during this era of good feelings. Now, Henry Clay's economic system federally funded internal improvements. That's what it promoted. It promoted roadways being created and, just anything that would improve the United States. That's what it wanted. And this also led to the implementation of tariffs, which meant that imports would now cost more. It would cost more to import stuff into the U.S. And he also wanted to reestablish the Bank of the United States. Now, the Tallmadge Amendment prohibited slavery in Missouri. It threatened to break up the Union, and Henry Clay proposed the Compromise of 1820, in which Maine is the free state and Missouri is the slave state. Basically, what was going on was Missouri wanted to come into the Union, but they couldn't decide whether or not it should be a free state or a slave state. And either way, it would debalance the whole system in Congress, which would make all decisions uneven, tilting towards slavery or free every single time. So they took in Maine and made that a free state and let Missouri be a slave state. Alright, moving on to page 11. Okay. Our American goals during this period were to firm our borders and expand more. These were our goals, we just wanted to expand more. The Adams-Onis Treaty was what took Florida into the Union and made it a state. And then the Monroe Doctrine basically said the Western Hemisphere is now American influence. Britain could not be in charge of the Western Hemisphere anymore. No colonization by Britain. The market revolution happened, and this linked the North industries with Southern farms, making Southern farms more advanced, and basically showed that industrial tools were technologically advancing. New transport was also introduced during this period, like steamboats that transformed trading because you could now go both ways on a river, and canals like the Erie Canal was built, and railroads in the 1820s and 30s were growing, and this all promoted growth in Western farming. Immigration was massive in this time period. 2 million Irish and German immigrants were coming into the U.S. They formed the growing poor working class, and they lived in tenements, which were very sad buildings. They established cultural traditions in America. They brought their culture into America, and this then made Americans have a middle class because we had a very poor working class and a less poor working class. During this, women had the cult of domesticity, and I don't understand my notes there. Whatever. During this time, also the voting, only the elite could vote. Only wealthy, rich, white males. And the Panic of 1819 was because of irresponsible banking practices and decreased exports demand, so less countries were demanding exports, and now there were new parties. Instead of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, we had the National Republicans and the Democrats. The National Republicans were loose constructionists and wanted federal power. They wanted a strong central government. And the Democrats were strict constructionists and wanted state power. The corrupt bargain that happened during John Adams' presidency, and Henry Clay was like, vote for Adams. Henry Clay said to vote for Adams. And then Congress agreed with that. Adams became president. But Adam then hired Clay as the right-hand man, and people were like, something weird going on inside the part, So basically there was foul play there. Jackson's presidency started right after that because people did not like Adams. And Henry Clay created the Whigs Party because Jackson's presidency wasn't what he wanted. The Tariff of 1828 happened during his presidency, and the Southerners hated this tariff. John C. Calhoun creates nullification because of this tariff for South Carolina. And South Carolina was like, well, sorry government, if you ask us to pay this tariff, we're out of here. We're leaving this union. So that didn't go well, but then we established the Force Bill, which basically enforced federal law in South Carolina. And South Carolina was like, okay, so we nullified your last law. We're just going to nullify this one too, you know that, right? So the Force Bill did nothing, and the tariff did nothing. Overall, federal laws did not apply to them, apparently. Moving on to page 13, we are over a fourth of the way through this. Alright, now page 13. Banks during this time period were closing when they couldn't afford the national bank payments, and the national bank recharter was vetoed. So the national bank wasn't allowed to be a thing anymore. So basically, Jackson killed the national bank. And state banks were required to pay the national bank, to be a bank. Now Jackson did something called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And it started with Worcester v. Georgia, and Georgia wanted the Cherokee out of there. And the Treaty of New Dakota forced Indians onto reservations along the Trail of Tears, which wasn't very nice of us. The dictionary was also invented during this, which was created by Noah Webster, and it standardized English for everyone. Transcendentalism became popular, how nature is where you can achieve perfection. The Hudson River School painted nature during this time, and it basically was helping them feel more connected and alive. Now, the Second Great Awakening happens, and this is when religious preachers went around preaching about how, you need to repent and stuff, you need to not sin anymore. And the Southern Baptists split, Charles Finney spoke the best, and he was the easiest to understand. He was a preacher that was just super relatable with all of the not colonists, all of the Americans, and this had emphasis on the moral reformation of society. And temperance was starting here, where alcohol is evil, and this came from the Second Great Awakening. And abolitionism during this time period became larger because The Liberator was a newspaper by William Lloyd Garrison. He also founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, and lots of women were supporting abolitionism too, but they wouldn't be heard because they were women, so no one was really listening to them. And that was when women realized they needed rights to be heard, so they were going to start fighting for rights, like with the Declaration of Sentiments, which fought for women's education, work, and voting rights. And finally, Nat Turner's Rebellion was an organized rebellion in Virginia. It killed 50 white people, and everyone involved was hanged. This was a slave rebellion, and all the slaves were hanged. Now moving on to Unit 5, which it doesn't feel like it's that long of a period because it's only 1844 to 1877, but it's pretty long. Manifest Destiny. This is Unit 5, like, huge deal of Unit 5, Manifest Destiny. Americans believed that they had a God-given right to all the land stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. They needed to own a stretch of land that stretched from ocean to ocean. Texas was part of Mexico during this time, and most of Texan residents were American, not Mexican. And Texas had outlawed slavery, and no one really liked that. During this time, Mexicans really didn't like that so many Americans were coming into Texas. They were worried, because that was fair. And so immigration from America into Texas was banned. Yet, tons of people still were immigrating into Texas illegally. And there was a treaty signed. There was a war that happened, and a treaty that was signed illegally by someone who was not authorized to sign it. And that meant that the treaty that would make Texas a U.S. state made it so it could not be accepted as a state. The election of 1844, James K. Polk won, and he was huge on Manifest Destiny. He had the deal of annexing Texas, and we'll see how that goes. Moving on to page 15, the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War started with border disputes about where is the border between Mexico and America. Mexicans lost ground against America, but so Mexico lost, and America got California and New Mexico. And this is from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the Mexican cession, which was all the land that we gained from this. The Wilmot Proviso said that any land gained from the Mexican-American War could not be a slave state, and it showed the tension between the rising slave state, free state debate. The Wilmot Proviso was not passed. The 1848 gold rush was exciting because we just got California, and California gold was found. And mining camps were built basically immediately, and the population in California went from 40,000 to 400,000 in just a few months, or just a year or something. Slavery in new states. Basically, the South said that slavery is a right, and people on free soil said that all land gained is free land. Abolitionists wanted slavery banned, and so we had this thing called popular sovereignty come up, which allowed the people in the states to decide slavery for themselves with an in-state election of decision of slavery. Then came the Compromise of 1850, which solved this whole issue that we were having with the Mexican cession. This was basically, it gave the decision of the people to have slavery in Utah and New Mexico, so popular sovereignty, and then California was introduced as a free state. It said that in Washington, D.C., you could not sell slaves anymore, and the Fugitive Slave Act intensified, which the North did not like. Since this Fugitive Slave Act intensified, Harriet Tubman established the Underground Railroad, which was a safe house trail set up to the north, in which slaves could become escaped and then free. Uncle Tom's Cabin was also written, which was an abolitionist novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it showed the evil nature of the slavery institution by showing how terribly slaves were treated. The Kansas and Nebraska Act divided Kansas and Nebraska, so the Nebraska territory was becoming states, and it was divided into Kansas and Nebraska. And it made the decision of slavery up to popular sovereignty for both of them. But if you don't know, Kansas and Nebraska are above the Missouri River line, which is where the South below it would be slave states, and above it would be free states. But since both those states are above, if either of them became slave states, stuff would get really weird. And it meant that slavery would move north. This resulted in Bleeding Kansas, in which people came into Kansas to vote for and against slavery, and there were riots, and there were huge issues with this, basically voters fraud. And Dred Scott v. Sanford was a Supreme Court case during this time in which Sanford brought slaves. Sanford was a slave owner, and he brought his slave Dred Scott to a free state and moved there. And Dred Scott was like, "No, you can't do that. I am free here. This is a free state." And so he sued Sanford, and the Supreme Court was like, "Hey, no, you're property. You are an object. You cannot sue others. Property cannot sue." So they ruled against Dred Scott, and that established slavery could be anywhere basically. Masters could take their slaves anywhere, and slavery could exist anywhere lawfully. This was an odd decision for the Supreme Court. Harper's Ferry soon happened, in which John Brown raided a federal arsenal called Harper's Ferry with some slaves to help fuel slavery revolts and give weapons to slaves. Completely failed. They were surrounded by the federal guard or whatever, and John Brown was hung. And his last words were written down on a note, basically said, "Nothing will happen regarding slavery if something drastic will need to happen to change this country." The Stephen Douglas versus Lincoln debates were basically presidential debates, or governor, I can't remember, where Stephen Douglas and Lincoln were fighting it off, and Lincoln ended up winning the presidential election later, and he was elected and did not like slavery. And this scared all of the southern states. Moving on to page 17. This led to secession. South Carolina was the first to secede, and 10 other states also seceded after them, and they all joined into what they called the Confederate States of America. Not all slave states seceded. There were 3 or 4 that stayed with the Union, and Lincoln's goal during this time was to just save the Union. The South advantages were that they were fighting a defensive war, and that they had better generals on their side, Lee and Jackson. The North advantages were that they had 4 times larger population, they had a robust navy, they had mostly economic power with most of the banks, factories, and railroads, and they had a well-established central government already where the South would have to create a whole new one. The Anaconda Plan was from the U.S. Navy, and they blocked all southern ports, which meant no supplies could get in, and this relied on Britain and France, but Britain and France didn't want to be a part of this, so we didn't get that. Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, which made the war focus from just saving the Union to abolishing slavery. This Emancipation Proclamation made it so it freed slaves in all Confederate states, and it made it so slavery was still a thing in the Union, but in the Confederate states, all slaves were freed, which encouraged enslaved people in the Confederate states to flee the South and join the Union Army and help fight on the Union side. The Battle of Vicksburg gave Union control of Mississippi River, which cut Confederate power in half. The Battle of Gettysburg is where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, where he said all men were created equal and the government will not perish. Ulysses S. Grant became the commanding general of the Union Army, and General Lee surrendered to him in 1865. This was how the Civil War ended. This led into a huge period of Reconstruction. How do we get this Union all back together? That was the question right now. The question was, should the South be treated kindly, and be accepted and helped back into the Union, or like an enemy that we just defeated because they were being jerks? And Lincoln, of course, erred on the side of kind, so we wouldn't have any saltiness or resentment towards the South. But to enter back into the Union, 10% of a state's male population had to pledge loyalty to the Union. And they also must ratify the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Lincoln's assassination was on April 14th, 1865, so he didn't even get to see the Civil War end. But he was killed by John Wilkes Booth in a play. I'm assuming most of you know that story. Radical Republicans pushed for black civil rights, and they really wanted to punish the South because they deserved to be punished, is what they thought. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 made all black people citizens of the United States. The 14th Amendment was then passed, which made all U.S.-born citizens, all people born in the U.S. were citizens, and all citizens have equal protection and rights. Page 19. Some Reconstruction acts that were part of Reconstruction divided the South into 5 parts that were separated into different military zones for different parts of the military to be in the South. And another part of these acts was that they also had to ratify the 14th Amendment to be a part of the Union, which once again established equal rights with all U.S.-born citizens. Andrew Johnson was very disliked for his Reconstruction policies, I guess, and most of Congress really wanted him out. So the Tenure of Office Act was passed, making it so the president could not remove a member without consulting Congress. And the Secretary of War was a radical Republican, and Andrew Johnson was against radical Republicans, but the Congress was mostly Republican. And so Johnson just fired him without consulting Congress, which made Congress be like, we shall now impeach you because of the Tenure of Office Act. But it wasn't successful because one person didn't vote. They were 1 vote short of impeachment for him, so he stayed in office. The 15th Amendment was then passed, which protected voting rights of former slaves. Society in the South at this time, they established black schools, and basically black independence was really hard because there were a bunch of things being passed and a bunch of societal parts that were just hurting the freed slaves. Like sharecropping, for example. The white owner of a bunch of land, farming land, provided the farming supplies for a price and required like rent to be paid for this land. And so then black people would then harvest this land and sell their goods, but they wouldn't sell enough to get profit. So they'd just be paying rent and farming on this guy's land. And this was because of white supremacy, which white supremacy during this time was a big part of why the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, was organized to terrorize blacks. The KKK burnt buildings, they committed lynching, and they hated other groups too, not just blacks. They were hating everyone at this time. In the South, the black codes prevented blacks from borrowing money. It also prevented black people from owning land, which was not exactly equal rights or protection. And then the end of Reconstruction in 1877 was because of the presidential election of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden. And the Compromise of 1877 said that Hayes gets the presidency, but federal troops were removed from the South. Basically, it was a weird election where it was really close, and Congress was like, well, you got none of the South votes, but we'll give it to you if you remove federal troops from the South. And that is Unit 5. Moving on to Unit 6, which I can't remember. No, this is the second longest one, I think. So Unit 6 is 1865 to 1898. Moving on to, Unit 6. Got lost. Alright. Unit 6 was focused on industrialization, urbanization, and westward expansion and migration. Railroads during this time were being built like crazy. They connected the east and west of the country and contributed to trade and movement of people, and basically the United States was much more connected at this time. The government provided 170 million acres to railroad companies to build railroads. The Panic of 1893 was where 1/4 of railroads filed for bankruptcy, and the rest of the railroads created monopolies on the railroads as more and more railroads had gone out of business. The Bessemer process was a way of manufacturing steel which was higher quality, quicker, and cheaper. And Andrew Carnegie basically took this to heart and created his Carnegie Steel Company using vertical integration. And the oil industry was basically all John D. Rockefellers, who founded Standard Oil, and Standard Oil owned 90% of oil stock and, business. And this was horizontal integration, which basically horizontal integration was where Standard Oil would go, hey look, there's another oil company, let me just buy that one, and oh, there's another one, let me buy that one, and now I have like 17 companies that are all now just Standard Oil companies, and they already have everything they need to make oil. And this was all because of laissez-faire capitalism, in where the government is basically hands off of all business regulation. Moving on to page 21. In this time period, social Darwinism was growing. Social Darwinism was basically only like Darwinism, only the fittest survive. Survival of the fittest. But social Darwinism said that the world's wealth concentrated into the best people is the best way to have the wealth concentrated. And Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth was kind of proof of this, in which he said that wealth should only be used for good. And Carnegie was extremely wealthy and spent like $300 million funding libraries and colleges and public spaces, and he was very charitable and he was a philanthropist. Trust busting during this time was basically checking monopolies and business trusts, making sure that they weren't taking up too much of the market share. The middle class was created during this, in which white collar work would be like in sales and managing, instead of the working class people where wages were barely sustainable and multiple people in a family would need to be working to earn enough, including their children, and working class was more in like factories and mines. But since this was so dangerous, labor unions were created, in which poor working conditions led to unions, and members asked for better conditions, and when like companies and employers would say no, strikes happened, which made owners comply with better wages and conditions because people weren't working anymore. The Pullman strike was the biggest of these strikes, in which wages got cut, the workers went on strike, Pullman ended up firing them all, and then instead of like getting more people hired and stuff, Pullman was boycotted by like everyone. No one rode Pullman. Some unions that were notable were like the Knights of Labor, in which all members were welcome. There was no child labor, no monopolies, but it was compromised after Haymarket Square riot, after a bomb went off, and no one trusted Knights of Labor anymore, even though no one knew if it was the Knights of Labor that set off the bomb. The American Federation of Labor was a union made by Samuel Gompers, and it protected basically everything. I mean, it covered it all. Immigration during this time was starting to get a little bit iffy. People immigrated to America because they heard that America was the land of liberty and opportunity, and unions opposed immigrants, since immigrants tended to work for cheap, which wasn't good for unions who wanted higher wages. They were worried that companies would just hire immigrants who would work for cheap, and then they wouldn't have any bargaining power for higher wages. The American Protective Association was very nativist, which meant they did not like immigrants. Westward migration grew in this time with the hope of self-sufficiency and independence, trying to get out of these factories. The Chinese Exclusion Act barred further Chinese immigration. This was the first act that limited any sort of immigration into America because people were worried about Chinese becoming too much of the workforce. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged westward migration and offered 160 acres of land to anyone who built on the land and lived there for 5 years. Basically just free land as long as you cultivate it. The reservation system gave small land grants to Indians and gave land specifically made for Indians to Indians. And this was where the Sioux War started. We are halfway through. The ghost dance movement during this time was an Indian ritual in which they did what they called the ghost dance, and white people would magically be removed. It didn't work, of course, and white people still kicked them off their land. The Dawes Act divided tribal lands into 160-acre plots and would give the land if Indians became Americanized and assimilated. The National Grange movement started because farmers were being exploited by railroads and trusts, and it was trying to defend the farmers. The Grange got the Interstate Commerce Act passed, which provided some regulation. And urbanization during this time, basically poor people were crowded into tenements, but around this time suburbs were started to pop up. Suburbanization, in which suburbs were built just outside of cities for the middle class and would be cheaper. Well, not cheaper, it would be nicer than living in the city, in the tenements. Political machines also grew during this time, and that was where corrupt political leaders and their followers would all vote for the same person. Tammany Hall was one of these. They met the needs of poor people in their community, and in exchange they would be like, hey, you should vote for this person since we've given you this food. It's only fair, you know? And settlement houses were a little bit better version of this, a bit better version of this, in which they provided services to the poor to better the community instead of for something. Like the Whole House, which was established by Jane Addams, and they were usually led by women. Speaking of, women's suffrage grew in this time, and Susan B. Anthony founded NASA, which NWCA, a National Association of Women's Suffrage Association. That feels super wrong. Women took up temperance, which meant no alcohol for them, and Carrie A. Nation, instead of just taking up temperance, she went from bar to bar, just destroying them, just casually. The social gospel during this time was that middle class should solve urban problems. And basically during this time, Mark Twain was a huge part in novels and stuff in which it depicted the true social structure and hierarchy of the world and people's true opinions on it. During this time, part of the social gospel was also like Frank Lloyd Wright, who was pioneering natural architecture. The New South during this time had economic diversity, laissez-faire capitalization, and only some of the South was developed. So it was like more of the South was becoming developed, but only specific parts you would find to actually be developed. Plessy v. Ferguson was a huge Supreme Court decision. They decided that separate but equal is constitutional. This all created the Jim Crow laws that made life more unfair for black people. Some people who resisted this and were like trying to defend the blacks and stuff was like Ida B. Wells, in which she resisted by using the news. And Henry Turner said for blacks to go back to Africa. So that was something that not many chose to do. And Booker T. Washington advocated for economical power for black people. Basically, that was the only way to move forward in the world. Political stuff during this time was just hands off of the world and very corrupted. Moving on to page 25. Water. Republican voters included the black people, middle-class businessmen, and Protestants. Democratic voters included big city political machines and immigrants. Patronage was giving jobs to workers and civil service. I see. Basically, the government positions were given to people if they are nice to the political power that's in power. The Pendleton Act was established to stop that. Basically, higher merit gets people government jobs, not just political favors. The gold standard was how paper money can only be backed by the amount of gold in the federal vaults. Tariffs during this time made farmers and consumers suffer. And this resulted in the rise of the Populist Party. The Populist Party wanted to correct monopolies. They used the Omaha platform, which was these things. They wanted the direct election of senators. They wanted citizens to propose and vote on new laws, which was initiative and referendum. And they wanted the graduated income tax, they wanted 8-hour workdays, and they wanted the unlimited coinage of silver. McKinley's presidency towards the end of this resulted, basically more gold was found as more land was expanded upon, and that meant more money supply vastly. And he actually took over most of the populist campaign promises to get more votes. So that's how McKinley was elected, because McKinley took most of the populists' ideas. Moving on to Unit 7, the longest unit by far. It stretches from 1890 to 1945. Let's take a breath here and get ready. Unit 7 focused on rural to urban and all the shifts of everything happening. A lot happened during this period. American imperialism started here, and we achieved Manifest Destiny. We got land from the Atlantic to Pacific Ocean. Now what? So we purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, and people were like, nothing's in Alaska. Why did you buy that? What was the point there? And so that was called Seward's Folly, because Seward was the one who bought it. But then they found gold in Alaska, so, who was really the right one here? Imperialists here wanted more people to sell to, like more economic opportunity, and they used a lot of social Darwinism since everyone does imperialism and has grown. So they were like, oh, these people have survived and they were imperialists. Josiah Strong said Americans needed an empire since we were born powerful. Congress approved the new Navy to be imperialists with. Just basically, they built a ton of ships so they could go be imperialists and go conquer other countries. The anti-imperialists said everywhere should have self-determination. No one should be conquered by anyone. And they were like, America has a long history of isolationism and it's gone so well so far. Something bad is bound to happen here. The Spanish-American War started and Cuba was being submissive because Spanish had attacked them. Spain ended up blowing up the battleship Maine on America's soil, though they didn't really. It was actually just a malfunction, but everyone blamed it on Spain. So everyone was like, alright, I guess we're joining the Spanish-American War, we gotta be at war now. And this was where America got much of the Spanish territory. Moving on to page 27. America was then imperialist towards the Philippines. We sent the Navy to the Philippines, and Spanish just gave America the Philippines. And that then was like, oh, we got the Philippines, we kind of want something in between there, so we annexed Hawaii from Queen Liliuokalani. Other areas acquired, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and a bunch of other Caribbean places that we were imperialists for. John Hayes introduced the open door policy, which basically was like, China, hey, we want to be part of your trade, We want to be included in your trade. So we had an open door policy with China now, which meant we could trade. And now we get to Theodore Roosevelt, his presidency. He ran with big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick. He made the Panama Canal, nothing huge. He stated the Roosevelt Corollary, which was basically the Monroe Doctrine, but protected Latin American countries from Britain power and debt collection because Britain was still colonizing Latin America, and so they were like sending payments back and forth from Latin America to Britain. They were like, you know what, Britain, no more. You cannot collect any more debts from these countries. They are their own places, which is ironic, showing that we just imperialized a bunch of countries. The Progressive Era was the rising power of big business. It introduced uncertainties in the economy, showed violence in labor groups and employers. That's just a bunch of stuff that happened. It showed the influence of political machines. It introduced Jim Crow segregation and started towards the rights of women. The progressives had the belief that American society sucked and only the government could fix it if, policies were put into place. Muckrakers documented the bad sides of American society, like the jungle, in which the poor, I can't remember if the jungle was the meat packing industry or if it was the tenements and stuff. Anyways, it just showed the bad sides of American society, environments, and economy and stuff like that. Really publicized how bad the American society was. The secret ballot was introduced, which meant voting without seeing, so no pressure. So, political machines were stopped. The 17th Amendment gave citizens the right to vote for senators. It introduced referendum, initiative, and recall. Which referendum, you get to propose bills, initiative, you get to vote on bills, and recall was basically you get to be like, oh, we voted you into office and we hate you as a senator, turns out, so you're on here. We elect you back out, W.E.B. Du Bois said that blacks needed to be recognized as politically equal. That he led the Niagara movement and he founded the NAACP, and then the Roosevelt Consumer Protection and Conservation Acts were put into place, like the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, and the Forest Reserve Act. Which Pure Food and Drug Act made it so labels had to happen, and the Meat Inspection Act provided regulation on the meat industries because of the jungle, the book, and the Forest Reserve Act was a conservation act which made it so there were national forests that were established and could not be chopped down. The Sherman Antitrust Act was also introduced by Roosevelt, in which good trusts need to be regulated that were using honorable regulations and stuff, and bad trusts, which were being totally shady and shifty, needed to be broken. Moving on to page 29. Theodore Roosevelt made the square deal during a coal miners' strike, and that was a deal with the employees the employers that they could work things out together, you know? The Wilson presidency then started, and he introduced tariffs like the Underwood tariffs. He introduced the Federal Reserve Act. He broke up more trusts and introduced the Clayton Antitrust Act, which just clarified the other Antitrust Act, which I forgot what was it called. Women during this time founded the Anti-Saloon League because of temperance, and they passed the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. So, temperance, but on a legal level. World War I started, and America really just wanted to be neutral. They started neutral, and then one of our ships, the Lusitania, sank in 1918. Well, not one of our ships, it was a British ship. So, Lusitania sank in 1918, and was a passenger ship, and there were American passengers on the ship. And it was Germany that sank the ship with their submarines. So the US was like, hey, we're gonna break diplomatic relations with you if you don't stop sinking American, like, ships with American people on it, or just all passenger ships. And Germany was like, fine, because that means that you would join the war and then you would totally dominate. And then they were like, oh yeah, we're gonna sink more ships. So they sank more ships, and the thing that really got us into the war was a Zimmerman telegram, in which basically a telegram was sent to Mexico and we intercepted it. Germany said to Mexico, hey, if you help us take down the US, we'll give you back the land that the US took. And we intercepted that, and it got published to the public, and the public was like, oh, okay, we need to go to war. And the government was like, oh, okay, we need to go to war. And the US joined war because of the Zimmerman telegram. Some wartime agencies that were established made it so that the American public should eat less meat and bread so we could send it to the troops. And more manufacturing jobs were needed, so people moved. Yes, more manufacturing jobs were needed for like guns and ammunition and stuff. And tanks and ships and cars. And so people moved to cities to work because there was a lot of manufacturing work that was needed. This resulted in the Great Migration. The ton of black Southerners moved north to get manufacturing jobs in the cities and to escape from South discriminatory laws. Not that the North was that much better, but they didn't have the Jim Crow laws. Exactly. The Espionage Act was enacted, in which anything that obstructed the war draft was illegal. And Schenck v. United States was a Supreme Court act in which it was established that you cannot say anything that would incite danger. So it was kind of like sedition, you know, where you couldn't say anything bad about the government. But here was like, if you said fire in the middle of a movie theater, that was illegal now. And the Sedition Act was also passed again, in which you could say no disloyal comments about the government. You couldn't be like, I'm Germany's side. You couldn't say that, or else you would be arrested. The League of Nations was established as an idea in which nations talk about stuff maybe, instead of just going to war and fighting to the death. And that was later established as NATO. Much later. The Red Scare during this time was the fear of the spread of communism. It contributed a ton to xenophobia, in which the fear of immigrants and people different than you, and it created a massive sense of paranoia. Page 31. Moving on to page 31. This is the 1920s, in which politics, like in the 1920s, some politics were like Warren G. Harding's campaign, in which the return to normalcy was, you know, coming into view, in which he was like, after this World War I, we need to feel more normal. So that was his campaign, and that's what made him win. With economics during this time, with the economy, there was an economic boom because there was an increased productivity and efficiency because of like advancements like the assembly line, which made an explosion in car manufacturing with Ford and stuff. The government contributed by cutting taxes, which was great for everyone. Some social parts of the 1920s were like opportunities for women. Like, yeah, they were paid less, but they sometimes did the same jobs as men now. And flappers were a big social advancement, in which women went against social standards and would dress like short dresses and short hair and, you know, do stuff that normal women hadn't done before. Workers feared that immigration would make pay go down. So same thing as before, they worried that immigrants would come in and make wages go down because immigrants worked for cheap. Immigration quotas were introduced, which made it harder for European immigrants to settle in America. And the Harlem Renaissance was a big part of the culture in the 1920s. It was a musical renaissance that introduced jazz. Black culture introduced jazz, and it produced musicians like Louis Armstrong. Louis? I don't know. I wrote down a name that I don't know how to pronounce. Entertainment. The radio was invented, and that was widely used for entertainment everywhere. Now, modernists embraced the changing culture. They liked it. They liked moving forward. Fundamentalists, though, they disliked social changes. The Scopes trial was basically a teacher could not teach evolution, but he was teaching evolution. And so someone was sued, and Scopes was convicted of teaching evolution, and that was against the law. And the public, this was all in public. It was broadcast over radio. It was everyone knew about it. And this made fundamentalism discredited because social change was maybe more important. And it made a lot of publicity for that city. The Great Depression started on October 29th, 1929, when the stock market crashed. People borrowed money from banks to invest it, but stock prices dropped, so people started selling like crazy, which means they weren't getting their money back, which means they couldn't pay the banks back, and so banks were failing, and then people were there were so many foreclosures on homes, and Hoovervilles were created, which were named after Herbert Hoover, which was the president at the time of the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt was becoming president, and part of his campaign was the New Deal. The New Deal included relief for the unemployed, which the Public Works Administration, which gave people jobs in public works, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, which gave Tennessee Valley electricity and gave work there. He also worked on the New Deal with the reform of financial institutions, like the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically made investments change in how people could invest. And the FDIC insured people's money. So basically you would put money into the bank and you would be hopefully it'll be there when I get back. Now it'll be if the bank fails, you get all of your money back, no matter what. Even the bank doesn't have it anymore. The Social Security Act was also passed, which took a bit of each person's paycheck and put it into the Social Security Fund, The New Deal was very criticized because by the conservatives, it was socialist and overreaching by the government, and liberals said it wasn't doing enough to help the Great Depression. Moving on to page 33, the Judicial Reorganization Bill was an attempt by Franklin Roosevelt, and he wanted to change who was in Supreme Court. I think it was 71 and older or something could not be in the Supreme Court. And he said, and that was a court packing bill because more of his side were younger, and people criticized him heavily for this. And so it was Roosevelt's only failure during his presidency. World War II then started in 1939, and America was isolationist at the start. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. Fascism in Europe grew, Hitler invaded Poland, and America started funding Britain so they could be part of the war with the cash and carry policy. Basically, they would sail across the sea, bring us cash, we would give them guns, and it was kind of under the table. And then finally, Pearl Harbor happened, where the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and bombed Pearl Harbor, and that made the US join war. Finally, they were we were attacked, we were hurt, now it's time to join the war. Federal spending grew 1,000% for the war, and just this took us out of the Depression. Spending so much money and putting so much money into the economy took us straight down the Depression. Japanese Americans were thought to be spies. Racist beliefs after Pearl Harbor sent over 100,000 citizens into internment camps, which shouldn't have been done. Korematsu, the United States, was basically hey, this isn't legal, we are citizens, you can't put us in these camps. And the Supreme Court was hey, these camps are wartime necessities, but we can't be sure that you guys aren't spies. And so that was the outcome of that Supreme Court case. The Holocaust, lots of Jews were killed, over 6 million. D-Day was the largest amphibious invasion in history. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, ending World War II. And then the island hopping campaign cut off the Japanese supply line we surrounded Japan and they couldn't get any supply. And this led to dropping of the atomic bomb. And the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and finally Japan surrendered because of that. The US emerged as the most powerful nation on Earth after Period 7. That's Period 7, that's Unit 7. Moving into Unit 8 here is 1945 to 1980. And straight away it begins with the Cold War. This was the conflict between a Cold War is conflict between two countries without open warfare. And this was the US versus the Soviet Union. Franklin D. Roosevelt died in his fourth term of being president, and his vice president, Harry Truman, jumped in. The Soviet Union is communist. The US does not like communist countries. And after World War II, Germany was divided into a bunch of sections. The Soviet Union got some, US got some, French got some, Britain got some. We split it evenly between the Allies. And the Iron Curtain is what Winston Churchill said about the political and social divide in Europe after the war. Containment was Truman's policy to contain communism, basically cutting off communism before it could get anywhere. The Truman Doctrine was part of this, in which the US would support any country being encroached upon by communism. So we would provide aid to any country that was in fear of becoming communist. Moving on to page 35, the Marshall Plan helped countries' economy to dissuade them from the thought that they need communism. Basically, if an economy was failing, the Marshall Plan said, hey, instead of you guys going to communism, we'll just give you some money so you can support yourselves and, get better. The arms race was huge at this point. It was a race against Soviet Union to develop superior arms. This was where the development of the hydrogen bomb, which was 100 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And basically we kept being against them, and they would keep advancing at the same rate as us. And it was okay, we are at the same level here. Both of us could destroy each other and destroy the world. So they were mutual assured destruction, stopped each other from shooting or, bombing. The Korean War, the North was communist, the South was democratic, and they ended up going against each other, going into each other's sections and stuff, and it ended with a stalemate with lots of civilian damage, and that led to détente, which was just coexistence between North and South Korea. The Red Scare happened again, but this time it was fear that communist Soviet spies infiltrated America. Joseph McCarthy said he had a list of Soviet spies, and they were trying to prove, he was like, I can't show you the list, We need this proof though, that you have this list of a bunch of Soviet spies in the American government. And he ended up just lying. It was just a complete lie. The GI Bill was then passed that sent veterans to college for free, and 2 million veterans took the US up on that offer. Levittown was mass-produced low-cost homes. Middle class moved to suburbs, and where all these low-cost homes were, and lots of middle class moved to Sunbelt, which were in the suburbs, and where it was warm and nice and economically growing, and so the middle class was really prospering here. Television replaced radio as the main entertainment, which meant so many people were watching the same thing since there were only a couple channels that it brought the world together. It brought people together, it gave people something to talk about, and ads were put on TV, which made US consumerism grow exponentially. Beat poets at this time were freeform poets. They rejected normal culture. They did drugs and did a bunch of stuff that wasn't normally culturally normal. And this was called counterculture. It was a counterculture movement. The Eisenhower presidency then overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board of Education, which meant schools became integrated, which was happy. The Southern Manifesto basically was saying that Supreme Court misused power in the Brown v. Board of Education, and lots of Southern schools decided to, instead of incorporating black students, just shut themselves down. And at one point, the 9 students going to a school were being blocked by the army, the state army. And then the federal guard came in and were like, okay, nope, we have to escort these 9 students into school since there was an army blocking you guys and people were being mean, The Montgomery bus boycott was where Rosa Parks wouldn't give up her seat. I'm sure you've heard of this. Martin Luther King Jr. rose up during this Montgomery bus boycott where people wouldn't go on these buses because of this injustice. And this also led to the sit-in movement where a bunch of black people sat in supposedly segregated places where it was like whites only. And then they would be taken away to jail and jails filled up, and it was a huge movement, which also one of these movements was the March on Washington. Hundreds of thousands of black people gathered, and people who wanted civil rights. And this was where the I Have a Dream speech was given by Martin Luther King. And this encouraged and empowered political changes to happen quicker. Moving on to page 37, water first. The results of these peaceful protests was like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in which discrimination on race or skin was illegal. And another was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. No discrimination in voting booths. So, discrimination was becoming less and less during this time. Malcolm X, though, decided to approach it a totally different way than Martin Luther King and others. He was like, separatism and militarism is the way to freedom. He formed the Black Panthers, and they caused a bunch of deaths and damage to get their rights. It didn't work out like they wanted it to. The Founding Mystique was a book written by Betty Friedan? I don't know. A woman should seek fulfillment in professional careers. That's what the whole message of the book was about. And then the American Indian movement addressed poverty and reclaimed cultural traditions. Basically, American Indians were trying to become less impoverished and trying to get their culture back from when it was taken during the Trail of Tears and, being on reservations. The Self-Determination Act of 1975 gave much more Indians control of their own government type choices. The Self-Determination Act basically gave Indians more cultural control. They were able to be less Americanized. It was a return to their own culture. Then the gay liberation movement, a big part of this was the Stonewall Inn raid. There was a raid on this gay bar, and instead of just letting it happen, the gays resisted the raid. And they began to start being encouraged to be themselves. Counterculture was huge during this time. It was like hippies, they used drugs, they liked sex, they used alcohol, and a bunch of counterculture people came to the Woodstock Music Festival. Music was a huge part of counterculture. Some Supreme Court cases here was like Baker v. Carr in 1962. Voting districts were drawn normally to include races, specific races. There's a black district, here's a white district. And Baker v. Carr said that districts drawn could not be drawn to include specific races. Miguel v. Vitale said that laws requiring prayers and Bibles in schools and stuff violated the separation of church and state. So, that was taken, you couldn't require prayers and Bibles in schools. During this time, decolonization was getting big. In Guatemala, U.S. assassinated Fidel Castro, who was colonizing places, and the CIA aided Iran, and U.S. got low oil prices and cheap arms from Iran. And they also, Vietnam was liberated from being colonized and was divided into North and South. But just like Korea, North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was democratic. And this led to some fear, This led to the domino theory, in which if South Vietnam fell to communism, every Southeast Asian country would turn communist. And this was Kennedy's theory. And so Kennedy sent in a bunch of troops to South Vietnam and then got assassinated a little bit after that. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, after Lyndon Johnson took office. Lyndon Johnson had the power to do whatever needed to protect the democracy, basically to contain communism there. And Johnson continued to escalate Vietnam War by sending 50,000 troops and stuff. And that's page 38. Alright, moving on to page 39, the Vietnam War. Many Americans died fighting a war they didn't agree with. So this was a controversial war. Many anti-war protests happened. College students hated the idea of getting drafted, so most of the anti-war protests happened in college campuses. Vietnam went on for a very, very long time and ended with no winner. There was no reason for us to be in Vietnam War. Just so many Americans died for nothing. The Great Society was basically a war on poverty. The Office of established the Office of Economic Opportunity, which established Medicare, which gave medical care to people over 65, and Medicaid, which was established to give medical care to anyone in poverty. The Immigration Act was established, which abolished immigration quotas, which means anyone could immigrate now. And the Richard Nixon presidency started in 1968. He ended Vietnam, and a recession began, which was called stagflation, which meant there was an economic stall, there was no economic growth now, but there was a lot of inflation happening. So, he had to cut federal spending. Nixon had the Watergate scandal, which basically people of his were caught breaking into the Democratic Party's offices to steal sensitive information and documents and data, and Nixon denied he had any knowledge of this happening. And turns out he lied, and that was found out by, some spies and investigations. And before Nixon could be impeached, he resigned because he lied. Roe v. Wade happened, and the question during Roe v. Wade was, is abortion a constitutional right? Abortion was ruled as constitutional by Supreme Court in all 50 states. The Environmental Protection Agency was established, which put protections on land, air, and water pollution. And that is the end of Unit 8. Moving on to our last unit here, Unit 9, which basically was the developments of modern times. It's 1980 to the present, or whatever the present is for history. Things like the conservative resurgence happened, where policies of Nixon and Gerald Ford restricting scope of government, everything was becoming conservative. The moral majority in 1979 aimed to unseat liberal Congress representatives. And the Right to Life movement basically said, like Christians, life begins at conception, which meant they were saying that abortion was murder. And affirmative action was introduced, which basically meant minority groups needed to be included in jobs. And conservatives called these DEI quotas reverse discrimination, because it was harder to get into colleges and jobs because you weren't of a minority. You were just white or Caucasian. Now, the Ronald Reagan presidency started, and the Senate became majority Republican. Reagan reduced taxes, he cut government spending, and he appointed new court positions. Moving on to page 41, Ronald Reagan introduced Reaganomics. It was basically supply-side economics is what it was actually called. And you could also call it trickle-down economics. He decreased taxes for corporations and removed business regulations, and he assumed consumers would benefit from the lower prices. This would also be called trickle-down economics, because business prosper equals employees prosper equals society prospers, which is not true. It just means the rich prosper more. And cuts to government spending. He cut government spending by cutting welfare program spendings by $40 billion, which is a lot of money. But over the course of his presidency, he grew the defense spending to $150 billion. So is he really cutting government spending? But there was lots of deregulation, businesses and stuff. The end of the Cold War came because the Nicaraguan intervention. Nicaragua became communist, and the Iran-Contra affair, basically, we sold arms to Contras and used that. We sold arms to Contras. We sold arms to Iran, and used that to fund Contras illegally. We used the money from the arms selling to fund Contras, which Contras then did a bunch of bad things to communists. They were totally against communism, and we said that we would fund anything that was against communism, like us. The end of the Cold War also led to the buildup of advanced weaponry, like missile shooting lasers from space, which sounds super cool. Glasnost said that it was an end to Soviet political repression, so Soviet Union stopped the repression of politics, and Perestroika basically introduced limited free market principles to the Soviet Union economy to revive it. And this led the Soviet Union to be oh wait, this free market is what capitalists and democratic stuff gets. Soviet Union was oh crap, we gave them a taste of stuff and they want more now? We're gonna become not communist, oh no. Now, another treaty was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. Basically destroyed tons of intermediate range nuclear bombs and stuff. Said we couldn't use them anymore. And the Berlin Wall was taken down this time during his presidency. And Reagan said, quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, ending Reagan's presidency, going into George H.W. Bush presidency, he oversaw the end of the Cold War, and he oversaw START 1 and START 2, which was a treaty between Russia and U.S. to reduce nuclear warheads to only 3,000. So we had 10,000, and we destroyed 7,000 of them. And it also sent U.S. economic aid to help the Russia economy, which was still dying because of the Soviet, Cold War and stuff, The Bill Clinton presidency was the longest peacetime economic boom in our history, in a long time. It led to a lot of technological advancements. It led to more mechanization of industries, which led to less jobs. And wages did not grow with advancements. So with the economy growing like it was, wages did not grow. So economy went up while wages were down here. I don't know. Bill Clinton also, the internet and cell phones and social media came out of this, and he got to be the first with that. Immigration. The South and West were fast growing because of immigration, and the Immigration Reform and Control Act was put into use. Hispanic immigrants was the largest minority at this time. Now, moving into the George W. Bush presidency, 9/11 happened. 9/11, Al-Qaeda crashed planes into buildings, into the trade centers, the World Trade Centers, and Bush then led this war on terror, which was just we went to the Taliban, and the Taliban would not turn in Osama bin Laden, who was in charge of Al-Qaeda. And Obama ended up capturing bin Laden way after Bush. We killed him then. And moving on to our last page, page 43. The Department of Homeland Security basically protected our homeland, America, from further terrorist attacks and provided regulations like airport security, And during this time, there are growing environmental concerns that the U.S. is too reliant on fossil fuels in the world in general, and there was increasing alarm about climate change. Overall, the U.S. during this period has continued being the world's largest superpower in the 21st century, and we probably will continue with that. That's it. That's all of Unit 9, all of Unit 1 through Unit 9 of AP U.S. History. You've got it on your AP test. You're going to do great. Just remember the important stuff and pray that everything is recalled. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you got some sleep, or, you got some information on this and are retaining it. Good luck on your AP test.